It's Cooling X. This plug-and-play, fully liquid-cooled, small form factor pre-built from Cooler Master's high-end experience division promises to be cool, compact, and quiet. Welcome to Machines and More. It's only got a single 240mm radiator to cool both a Ryzen 9 and an RTX 4080, but there's a little bit more to it. The Cooling X is a pre-built desktop system that integrates the case as part of its holistic thermal solution. So we saw this model back at Computex 2023 in their on-site exhibition, and they had a demo one with clear panels, visible coolant to show how the cooling chambers work. In simple terms, the chassis is a vital part of the cooling system. So today we're going to be taking a look at this 14.8 liter mini-itx tower, and I'll talk through the features that make this pre-built viable. I'll show some thermals, noise levels, and I'll share some feedback about this system overall. So I'm super excited to be checking it out and showing this one to you. Before we begin, big thanks to Cooler Master for making this review possible. This system is a pre-production unit provided for testing by Cooler Master for the purposes of review and feedback, but I am not compensated by them for this review. They're not privy to this video or the findings ahead of time, and I don't get to keep this or use this unit long term. In fact, by the time you see this video, it's probably back with them already. So one thing to note up front, this pre-production unit I'm testing, it doesn't feature the final spec. Instead of the 7950X 3D CPU the production model is supposed to feature, this one has a 7950X instead. So CPU benchmarks aren't going to be necessarily as meaningful for this review. Later on, I will show you how the 7950X CPU boost clocks are with this cooling system, just to give you an idea of how it works. But while they are close, the 7950X clocks higher, and it's going to be a bit better for multi-core processes. Because the X3D has an additional 64 megabytes of L3 cache, it's going to be the stronger gaming performer in general. But probably the most significant difference as it applies to the review findings that I want to caveat is that the 7950X 3D runs with about 70 to 75 watts less power draw at 100% utilization. So I will kind of simulate that by manually limiting the PPT after we do some initial testing. So based on Cooler Master's literature, it is targeted at high-end gamers and creators who want the ultimate plug-and-play experience. So the 7950X, it's kind of a sensible choice for a one-size-fits-all CPU approach. So I believe that other than the CPU, this one is the final spec. It uses the MSI B650 ITX. At Computex, it was shown with the ASRock B650E. 64 gigs of DDR5, 5600 megahertz RAM. This kit in the tester here is a Kingston Fury kit. That's paired with RTX 4080. Uses Cooler Master's Gold SFX 850 watt power supply. And for storage, it comes with 2 terabyte PCIe 4 NVMe drive, so it's mostly high-end spec. It's not the absolute highest end spec you could get. The product manager did mention to me that the heat dissipation, it's a consideration in not speccing a 4090.
And some people question, why are you not using a 4090?
Right.
But the issue is we wanted to keep it compact, and if you are utilizing a 4090, that the case will be bigger.
So here I'll have it next to a SEP meshless just for reference. This case is 372 millimeters tall, 149 millimeters wide, 266 millimeters deep, so it is compact at 14.8 liters. You got 2 thin LED strips built into the front panel. The Cooler Master logo power button lights up as well. Your side panel frame extends beyond the main box, and it serves to elevate the case off of the work surface so the bottom can get some intake air. And you know that the handles can be quite handy if you are moving it, because this is a very, very heavy system. 17.3 kilograms or 38.1 pounds. Right, so it's a big guy. So the cooling system works like this. At the back, you got a 240mm radiator mounted here, 2 exhausting 120mm fans. It looks like the Mobius fans inside. And the system, it intakes from the bottom of the unit through a mesh dust filter, so the airflow is out the back. Normally, a single 240 unit would be just enough to handle the CPU alone. The 7950X 3D, it will draw about 245 watts for a multi-core process. So running that on a 240, it's mostly okay. But throw in a 4080, and that's way too much for just a single 240. Take a look at the side panels. From the outside, they look like they're sculpted out with grooves for some aesthetic reason, but underneath this aluminum shell is a liquid chamber, and the side panels act both as a reservoir and also a heatsink to passively heat exchange with the operating environment, and together with the radiator and the pump, the side panels act as your cooling system. The production model doesn't have a clear windowed interior, but if you look at the one from the show, I'll just pull that up here, that gives you an idea what the inside looks like, and it's really neat design. 2 panels, they hold 0.42 liters of coolant altogether. The full system has just a little over a liter of coolant that is circulated with a pump that is capable of 320 liters per hour, and that works out to be a maximum of about 4.5 full turnovers per minute. So inside it is a sandwich tower layout. We have the motherboard with the headers connected to the I/O at the top rear of the case. The pump on the system panel, it tucks in below when the panel is closed. On the other side, you have the 4080 with the I/O facing up. It's connected with a riser cable with the fin GPU block. It's not a full cover though. You still have parts of the PCB exposed, but this cover basically covers the vitals enough. Underneath, there's a spot with pre-connected SATA data and power cables for an SSD if you wanted to install one. And then there's the power supply here. It's a VSFX 850 watt Cooler Master unit. So a little mixed bag on how this thing works. So first off, firing this system up, I actually noticed it was oddly loud, and it was a head scratcher since none of the fans were showing a particularly high speed. Again, pre-production unit, I thought, that thing can kind of happen sometimes. I then traced the noise back to the power supply, which was making quite a bit of noise. I was comparing against my experience with the 850 watt Cooler Master VSFX, which, although it's not quiet, it's not this loud. And then when I opened this one up, I discovered it's one of the newer V850 SFXs that has the 12V HPWR connector, which is used to directly connect to the 4080. So I haven't used this new version yet, but the 1100 watt VSFX Platinum, it's louder, and I'm wondering if this is just a louder power supply to begin with. At any rate, it's quite loud. And take a listen with the case fan set at 70% and the pump at 80%, and then listen when that power supply fan starts ramping up. A little bit of a performance spoiler here, if you will. The system rad fans almost need to run 100% for it to cool adequately in a heavy combined use scenario. This is with 100% on the rad fans, and you can hear how loud it is. The power supply fan is going, it's not quite full throttle yet. When the panels start heating up, when the system gets load, then you'll see that power supply, it really gets loud. So this power supply has got to be at 100% right now. It is really loud. That's the newer VSFX 850 watt. I haven't tested this one yet, the new one with the 12V HPWR, but it sounds pretty comparable to the 1100 watt unit when it is loaded pretty heavily. And keep in mind, this 4080 is only at about 280, 285 watts board power. CPU doesn't really do much in Heaven 4.0. So for it to be running at full throttle for this kind of load, it's indicative that there's something else going on here. Maybe there's a thermal sensor that's triggered by the proximity of the side panels, which they're running pretty, it's pretty hot right now. I think it's at least 53, 54 degrees. That could be triggering something in the power supply itself. The ambient environment in there is also very hot. I'm keeping in mind that one of the goals here is quietness, and with the power supply fan so loud, it's a little bit tricky to figure out what is the noise optimized fan level to test at, because it kind of masks a lot of that sound. But at any rate, I chose 70% of the, for the rad fans, because that was the level I felt comfortable with. The pump, although it's not loud, it does have an audible higher pitched hum past 85%, so I limited it to 80%. The Mobius fans, they're really acceptable at 70% or 1500 RPM. So if the system can run acceptably well for gaming, and then for a single, just a CPU only base render. And I think mostly the mission is accomplished here. So first off, I ran the 7950X without any power limitations, just for a CPU only render. This isn't the final spec CPU, of course, but just to get an idea of the cooling potential you have here. In a 25-degree ambient room and those aforementioned fan settings, it does eventually hit the throttle temp of 95 degrees. Of course, keep in mind the 7950X at this point is getting about 190 watts of power still, and the higher clock CCD1 cores are at 5.1 gigahertz, while the lower CCD2 is at 4.9 gigahertz or so. So this is well within the expected performance levels. There is a lot of liquid volume and thermal potential here with the case as a whole. So an advantage of the system is that it takes quite a while to get the panels to warm up and saturate. So chances are if your workload is intermittent or it's bursty like a lot of rendering systems or rendering applications might be, then it might be pretty good in that regard, since the coolant, it might only get slightly warmer during the render, and then you'll get higher boosts out of your components. You do some stuff during the downtime while the coolant cools off, then it kind of bursts again. That can work. The hottest part of the panels got to be about 43 degrees Celsius after about 15 minutes of rendering with the 7950X. For most gaming purposes, the 7950X and 7950X3D, they won't have a major difference in terms of the power draw, but now we are adding in the GPU, which, although the 4080 is spec'd with the total board power of 320 watts, similar to the 3080, in actuality, it usually hits a max of 300 watts, and it runs closer to 280 to 285 watts on average. With the fans at that 70% level, I ran Heaven 4.0 with the GPU getting full utilization here. This is actually a pretty good GPU temp, but here's the downside of the CPU sharing the loop with the card. Panels, they are getting hot at around 53 degrees C. The coolant is pretty hot at this point, and that is pushing the CPU close to throttle temp, despite it really not doing much for Heaven 4.0. Also, the motherboard sensors are all coming in at a fairly high temp for the CPU not getting much power. It's not really a concern for the board itself. For example, the most temps here, they're getting into the 60s, but keep in mind, when this was actually utilizing the CPU, only got up to 77. So I think it's indicative of a higher ambient temp in the case. You have kind of insulated side panels here, right? You could increase the rad fan speeds to 100% like I showed earlier, and you'll bring down the GPU temp and the case panels more than a few degrees to about 45 degrees. The good news is the CPU temps, they're not that close to 95 degrees anymore, but the system was already really loud at 70%, and now at 100% it's really, really loud. And keeping in mind one of the product goals here being quiet, I really would be hesitant to recommend bumping up the rad fan levels to maximum, but that may be what it takes for the combined use scenario. Taking a look at the GPU clocks, this one behaves mostly like a reference or a founder's edition card with the way it boosts. So 2700-ish megahertz that it settles into, it's a pretty basic 4080, to put it that way. For GPU limited 1440p gaming with a 70% fan and 80% pump level, the case panel temps are still similar to Heaven 4.0, still around the 53 to 54 degree mark. GPU temps are good. GPUs in general benefit pretty well from direct eye cooling, but this CPU is, again, toasty. So again, keep in mind the final production version with the 7950X3D will have slightly different thermal performance characteristics. When I simulate the power draw for a 7950X3D, the temps are way better. So I think 7950X3D is the better choice here for this system. But overall, I think the thermal performance for this system, it feels like it's barely adequate at the higher fan, even with the higher fan RPMs when it's a heavy combined load. And in terms of the noise, that power supply, it's really throwing things off here. Elephant in the room is the cost. There's no sugarcoating this. This is an expensive pre-built. MSRP is $7,000 US. Now, if you look at the components included, if you were to just get them at retail, new, you're somewhere around $2,600. The implied cost for the case, the rad, the cooling solution here, it's not a small amount. So it's hard to put a price tag on this unique cooling solution. For one, it's not something that you can just go out and buy or get custom made easily. because it's a very specific integration of case and cooling and the blocks and everything. And my impression is that they're not going to be making too many of these, so it's not like the tooling costs will scale well with the limited volume here. So it's understandable that it's expensive. Perhaps fiddling the platform where they're selling these is called mini-itx. It's a new site launched by Cooler Master where they're offering their high-end luxury focused products like the Orb X, the Motion 1, all those cool things you saw recently, and the custom builds like the Shark X sneaker. There are lots of cool stuff. So the target user is going to be a little bit different than your typical DIY PC enthusiast. So with that in mind though, if I were in the market for a high-end pre-built like this, not that I have one, but if I put my luxury buyer hat on, I do think a few items here would make the experience more complete. So first off, we talked about the PSU. That needs to be checked out. I think I'm wondering if the hotter operating environment insulated by the two hot side panels is really throwing off the PSU's temps and therefore throwing off the fan speed behavior, or maybe there needs to be a quieter one implemented here. On the fans and the pump, it would be nice to have an interactive Windows-based application that the user can use to adjust the fan curves. Your typical plug-and-play user, it's not necessarily going to want to see system temps or need anything granular like custom fan curves, but a simple preset, if Cooler Master were to put one together, that like silent, performance, balance, whatever, with some color bar graphs would help the user set up the system to their liking. The only software that this thing comes with from Cooler Master is just to adjust the LEDs. And then perhaps the application could also showcase how the system is running and give a graphic display of the system health. That kind of thing, just vital statistics, would be cool and useful for the end user. Next, I know this board doesn't have a coolant temp probe header, but setting fan curves based off the CPU temp, which is how it's working out of the box, is potentially problematic for noise consistency and that noise ramping up and down of the fans. There should be some kind of monitor or sensor to allow for a tune of the system based off of the coolant temps. Speaking of the board, I reviewed this one. The MSIB 650i is a good board and my recommendation for a budget-friendly Ryzen 7000 build. But this is a high-end pre-built here, right? And it's got one of the longest post times for Ryzen 7000 ITX boards. I would probably go with the Asus B650E ITX here, a little bit higher end. You got a coolant temp header that would be helpful for the points that I noted earlier. Fast post times, probably a better suited board for this kind of build. And you guys know the cost difference between those two boards. It might be a lot when you're considering, building it yourself, but this is a drop in the bucket with the MSRP in the backdrop. One thing that would be helpful is a little bit of optimizing. For example, out of the box, XMP wasn't turned on for the memory. Generally, that's a stable setting, so I'd feel comfortable enabling that as a manufacturer for the end user. And hey, maybe just test it because they're dropping a lot of cash on it, right? Lastly, the placement of the top I/O is really tricky since this is a tower. They're all at the top, at the back, and the I/O cables are all going to be drooping down from the top and very noticeable. You're going to need longer cables too, potentially, so it's not really the most elegant presentation, especially for an SFF build, right? So I would have preferred a lower placement here. So to wrap this one up, it's a really nice idea. It's a really expensive, nice idea. If I were plopping down this kind of cash for a luxury system like that, I want everything to be a little bit tighter. It's definitely an acceptable performer. It's compact. It needs to be more quiet, and I think it can benefit from a few tweaks in the user experience. But geez, these case panels are so cool, and they make use of otherwise not often used space. Seeing that they're a great idea and that they have serious potential, if this could be something offered as a standalone cooling product, that might be a good idea too. So thanks for checking this one out with me. I'll leave links for the components below if you're serious. Leave a link for the system. Please give a like if you enjoyed it. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you in the next video.